I'm Kitty from the Rarimo contributor Rari Labs. And Rarimo is a ZK protocol making both identity and reputation private. So to give you an example of what this kind of tech unlocks, about 6 months ago, we released a tool for surveillance-free voting called Freedom Tool. And this solution was almost immediately picked up by Russian dissidents who used it to protest Putin. So if you were curious about the title of this talk and who our registry angered, the answer is the Kremlin. And after surviving several attacks from the Kremlin, it was then picked up by dissidents in Iran who used it to protest the Islamic Republic. And most recently, we had our first use case with elected officials in Georgia, where opposition MPs used it to run tamper-proof polling. But in this talk, I'm going to outline how in the process of deploying in these regimes, where privacy cannot just be an abstract concept, but has to be unbelievably robust, we discovered serious issues with the pre-existing frameworks that almost every identity model currently uses in Web3. And I'm going to describe how we circumvented these issues and built a system with unprecedented levels of privacy and decentralization. So, as I mentioned, Freedom Tool is a surveillance-free voting solution, and it overcame a long-term challenge in the digital democracy space, which is how do you run the kind of identity checks that ensure that voters are eligible to vote without simultaneously making them vulnerable to hacking? And the answer, as you would probably guess, is through ZKPs, and more specifically, passport ZKPs. So the solution is super easy to use. All you do is take your passport and you just use your phone to tap the NFC chip inside of the passport. And Freedom Tool verifies the data and produces a ZKP that then issues an anonymous voting pass. And all the votes themselves are published onto the blockchain where they're tamper-proof. And everything is completely abstracted, like the entire process as well to register takes like 15 seconds. So it's super easy to use. You don't need any prior understanding or knowledge of like blockchain or ZKP. And most of the people who did use this tool were not crypto native people. They were just like regular guys. And everything's of course generated client side, like nothing ever leaves the mobile device. And nothing ever passes through a centralized server. So our first use case in Russia was led by this guy called Mark Fagan. And Mark is a former Pussy Riot lawyer and a prominent activist in Russia. And he used it to build an app called Russia 2024. And they hosted a referendum that challenged Putin's inauguration. And it invited Russian citizens to vote on whether or not they considered the electoral system in Russia to be legitimate. And in total, it had over 40,000 votes. In the first 24 hours of release, there were over 25,000 downloads, which broke records in Web3. And this not only gave dissidents like an outlet and an opportunity to protest, but the actual kind of key motive behind creating it, or Mark's motive, was to create a better feedback loop between opposition leaders and dissident populations. Because it's in regimes like Russia, it's of course like very, very hard to get a sense of what the people that you're seeking to represent, if you are a dissident leader, actually won. And they were using voting as a kind of like crude feedback system to get better insights into that. And so I'd say the biggest challenge deploying this was actually like the trust and the fact that when you are voting in a scenario like this, you are taking on an enormous risk. You can face up to 7-year prison sentences in Russia for protest. And the levels of engagement actually superseded expectations. And we anticipate that as other sort of dissidents and Russian citizens see that the people who use these tools did go unpersecuted and weren't traced, engagement will build in the app. And it was quite publicly attacked by the Kremlin on several occasions. They did all kinds of things. The sort of like craziest and I think most like anthropologically interesting thing was it turns out that they have like a kind of cabal of like state-sponsored app reviewers. And they basically just got these app reviewers to tank the app and give it loads of bad app store ratings, so it was difficult to find. But even these people who were tanking it were sort of messaging the app at the same time, being like, please don't remove this, we really need anonymous voting in Russia. And I think ultimately the fact that it was publicly attacked and then survived ended up increasing trust in the technology. Like, if it can withstand an attack from the Kremlin, it's pretty robust. So it was then picked up almost straight away, used in Iran for a very similar use case there. Amin Soleimani's NGO, Iran on Chain, led it, and they used it to give Iranian citizens a chance to express a lack of trust in the presidential elections in Iran. And it was then most recently used by Georgian MPs, as I mentioned, who used it to host tamper-proof polling, but they also used it to try combat low voter turnout. So they created a point system where people were rewarded for polling or voting or doing anything that kind of indicated political activity, irregardless of allegiance. So that's a kind of overview of how the tool has been used so far. But to kind of like get a bit under the hood and into the problems that we experienced whilst building it, the kind of biggest challenge that we faced, and that's like at the heart of why so many pre-existing frameworks in Web3 are not robust enough, is the issue of uniqueness. So if you're voting, it's pretty obvious like why you need to verify that users are unique. Like, you don't want you don't want people coming in and like corrupting the vote and voting like endless amounts of times. But there are kind of endless use cases where uniqueness is critical. So if you just look at like airdrops and issues with like bot farmings, it's a really essential characteristic that any identity framework needs to be able to verify and support. But it's also like the kind of biggest Achilles heel where privacy is concerned. So like if you imagine, you need to not only confirm that a user hasn't already registered, but they're different from all the other users in the system. So what most pre-existing frameworks in Web3 have found themselves forced to do is actually to rely on third-party attesters, usually NPCs, to issue users with a proof of uniqueness. So we use passports for uniqueness, but say you were a protocol that took like fingerprints, how it would typically work is you would like go and scan your finger, and a nullifier of your fingerprint would be created, and then it would be checked against all the other fingerprint nullifiers in the system, and you would then be issued with like a proof of uniqueness. And this could be a massive privacy problem because it makes it possible to figure out exactly what you're using the infrastructure for. So like, because you send that request and you're like, I want to issue a proof of uniqueness now for this thing, there's a huge like vulnerability in the system. And if you are operating in like a super high risk environment, like in Russia, and you are doing this dissident voting, then even being able to figure out participation is like a huge risk that we basically weren't willing to take. But there were all sorts of other issues with this kind of third-party attester-based infrastructure, as well as all many other kinds of use cases that aren't as extreme as dissident voting, where you would really want to make sure that the privacy is intact. But to go back to other risks, it's very vulnerable to regulatory interference when you have a third-party attester. They can demand data, shut it down, fine you. But I think even more alarmingly is it just perpetuates this cycle of dependency on centralized parties that like the whole of Web3 is trying to get away from. And you shouldn't be having to like ask some other entity to issue you with a proof of your uniqueness. You should be able to do that yourself. And we're in like the very early phases of identity as an industry. And I think it's absolutely critical that we correct this infrastructure now so that we have like optimal levels of decentralization going forward. And just the risks that I have outlined are only the ones that are visible in these very early days. They will like intensify as the industry continues to develop. So we decided to tackle these problems. And we built what we call the Rarimo ZK Identity Registry, which offers like an entirely different paradigm, and it allows users to permissionlessly self-issue their own identities, and it completely does away with third-party attesters. So how it works is you take your passport, and you publish the nullifier from the passport directly on chain into the registry. And then whenever you want to prove your uniqueness, you self-generate a proof of inclusion inside this registry. So no third party at all, and completely self-issued. And this is so robust from a privacy perspective because it severs that ability to trace exactly what the user is generating their identity for. And even in like a worst case scenario, if someone stole your passport and they got a hold of the keys and they were able to scan it, all they would be able to figure out is that you are registered in the registry. They wouldn't be able to figure out if you used it for voting or if you used it for meme coins or for anything else. And we've christened this the privacy as network effect model, because the more apps you have in the system and the more users you have in the system, the stronger the privacy guarantees, the more diluted it becomes, and the more difficult it is to figure out like exactly what people are using the infrastructure for. So I hope that that kind of adds like an incentive to build on Rarimo, like as well as offering these like stronger privacy guarantees and these decentralization, like higher decentralization and permissionlessness and self-offering. Anything that contributes to the ecosystem protects the most vulnerable users in the ecosystem as well. And the other thing that's really cool about this infrastructure is that the other thing that's really cool about this infrastructure is that passports are only the start. So there's many, many different types of sub-registries that you can build, and there's many different identity types that can be mathematically proven and that you don't need an attester for. So at the moment, we're focused on building out what we call like the ZK reputation sub-registry. And this is kind of the start of moving your entire social graph into like a private but verifiable state. So this registry in particular supports all sorts of next-gen social use cases. We have like new forms of social media being built on top of it. Interestingly, we've had a bunch of prediction markets experiment with it and use it to kind of integrate reputation systems so that the markets become about more than just betting and have a kind of like Reddit-style feed underneath to encourage discussion. So the infrastructure is very, very broad. It supports a lot of different use cases, and hopefully we can inject more privacy, more decentralization, better human connection into multiple use cases and go far beyond voting. So if any of you have anything that you want to build or that you're interested in talking about, or if you just want to keep up to date with the project, you can follow us on Twitter. You can also like DM me. That's probably where I'm most responsive if you have any ideas or you want to talk. And thank you so much for listening and for the platform.
Cool. Thanks, KITty. Privacy is freedom. So any questions? She's faster.
Thank you for the talk. I was wondering, so you mentioned like your technology, Rarimo, can be used in countries like Russia and Iran for privacy. So I'm actually from the US, but I moved to Russia. I live in Russia, and I'm a ZK developer because I honestly am afraid of being like pursued by like the US government. And, like, it's just sketchy living in a Western country as a ZK developer. My question is, like, do you think this technology can also be used in Western countries for private voting? Like,
definitely. So Freedom Tool is open source, which means that like anyone, anywhere can use it. And the groups that have used it were simply the ones that were most motivated to build on top of it. So anyone, anywhere can use it. And I think like even if you are not operating in a regime, there are a lot of reasons why you would obviously want voting to be private and untraceable and also tamper-proof, because it isn't just the privacy, it's the reliability of the results. And I think also the Georgian use case was a really interesting insight into how you can use these tools to kind of increase or try and encourage democracy in other ways. So they did the kind of incentives to try combat low voter turnout, this point system. And they also pledged that if they were elected, they would use the infrastructure to experiment with liquid democracy, which is where people vote not just in one like presidential election, but repeatedly on lots of different legislation. And digital voting makes that possible in a way that physical voting doesn't, because physical voting is so expensive. Like, I wish I could remember the exact stats, but it's something like 10 or 20 times more expensive than doing digital voting. So yeah, you can really like experiment with democratic models with this infrastructure, and it's not just limited to extreme use cases.
Hello, thanks for the talk. How do you provide the tamper-proofness of that passport scanner? Can I be like malicious person to provide malicious passport scanner and then just like register a bunch of IDs?
So I didn't hear the last bit.
Oh, so can I just be malicious actor and set up like malicious passport scanner to register a bunch of like IDs using?
Yeah, do you mean like if you got a hold of loads of like other people's IDs, or you kind of like hijacked the passport system?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that was something we thought about a lot. And for now, we were like confident that passport infrastructure won't be corrupted, because like if a government starts toying around and like issuing loads of fake passports, they destroy that entire system of trust. But then, like, of course, you could like steal someone else's passport maybe and register it. And at the moment, we don't have a mechanism for preventing that. So we're looking at doing like ZK ML stuff, where you can do a sort of like liveness facial scan anonymously, like alongside the passport, to check that, you know, it's the same person and that they're there. But, you know, there's kind of obvious limitations at the moment with that, with like the amount of computation that it takes, and all of this has to happen client side on a mobile, so that it never goes into that centralized server, and we retain like the decentralized nature of it. So I would say that's like one of the big things that we're like thinking about at the moment, is how you like really, really shore up the kind of human risk around the passports.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, great.
Thanks, guys.
KItty.